what we're going to talk about today are the great Scots, and some stories about osteopathy. And as we look at our image up here, we have what I consider the greatest Scot is William Smith. And then we also have John Martin Littlejohn, James and David Littlejohn. And this is the faculty from 1899. And what's interesting is basically a third of the faculty were Europeans. Then these are family members, Dr. Still, his son Charles, Herman, and they kind of adopted Hildreth when his father died and helped raise him as a child. So a third of it was then just family, and then a third of it would be Earl Laughlin and McConnell and Proctor. These would be some of the great names that were just from other colleges in the United States. And so it's interesting to see how important the European influence was. And certainly with that, I should say, the Canadians, the number of Canadians that were early students, and we have all those records and stuff, is really very impressive. But we're going to talk about the Canadians, kind of in a good way, in a bad way. They might have been responsible for making sure that A.T. Still was born, the founder of osteopathic medicine. But what Dr. Still had to say about osteopathy was that he really did make it available to all countries. He was training Canadians, Japanese. He was sending it out to Australia. One of the earliest osteopaths was Florence McGeorge, and she had an eye problem and fell as a child when she may be 12 or 13, and just slowly was losing her eyesight. By the time she was a young woman, it was on the verge of almost being gone. Went to England because that's where the best medicine was. They said, no, you got to go to the United States. This guy, Dr. Still, can help you. He did some work on her neck, able to get her vision to come back. She trained to be an osteopath and then took it back to Australia and then around the world. So it is fascinating, the connectivity. Dr. Still, basically in 1913 proved that it was a science. His worry was that it would become too medical, and I think this is what I see in the United States is our doctors do more pharmacology and more medicine, and the more medicine you put in, the less osteopathy there is, because there's a lot of natural things you can do with osteopathy. And so it's a right that we have, which sadly enough, some of our physicians, they learn it, they know it works, but then they don't practice it, and though they use it in diagnosis, they then refer them to someone else to do the manipulative work. So I think it'll always be around, but it'll be more like a referral. I think at some point it's going to grow that we'll have this class, such as the osteopaths you see in Canada, being our referral for things no different than you would for physical therapy or anything else. So that's just my opinion on it, my guess. But Dr. Still, towards the end, he thought that the only thing that would save osteopathy was an international movement. Where he received his interest in healing, actually we go back a couple hundred years before his birth. The Stills, though you look at Dr. Still, he came from the frontier, a real humble person. They've always been very intellectual and very great people, including basically Queen Elizabeth's bishop was John Still. And he made enough money as a bishop and invested it in lead mines that he created wealth that would sustain his family for generations. And so that basically came down all the way to Dr. Still's family. But then you say, well, wait a minute, how come he was poor on the frontier? We'll move into that. But this house still stands, Hutton Manor. John Bishop is buried in the cathedral in Bath and Wells. That's where you put the bishop. And that's his kind of effigy there. And this is just a little paperwork where the family was just confirming, yes, indeed, John Still was related. So he was probably the second most powerful person after Queen Elizabeth in England. And if we look at his effigy, if we were to stand over that sarcophagus, that's what we would see. And there's A.T. Still. And so it's interesting, the genetic strains. Now the funny thing is we look at Stills, and they all continue to have the same look. I mean, it's almost like a breed of a dog. I mean, in fact, like a German Shepherd's a German Shepherd. Well, a Still is a Still. And no matter how many times they marry, that genetic material comes out. Hey, welcome, guys. We're just getting started, so come on. But we were, like I said, I think it's fascinating to see the same nose, the same deep-set eyes, and the same beard, because you see the Stills don't have much of a chin, and so that beard actually balances out their face. So it's almost required. But the connection to England then would be that the wealth that was created by John Still was passed on basically to the great-grandfather Samuel of A.T. Still, who came to the United States to become even wealthier. And he was identified as a spy by England and shot. But he left his money to his son Boaz, which was A.T. Still's grandfather, who was a slave owner. And his father, Abram, grew up around slaves and thought nothing of it. But then he went away to college and became a physician, being a kid privileged on the plantation, got his medical education, but came back and in talking to the slaves, realized what a horrible situation it was, and really let his father know that, look, if we continue to make our money on slaves, I really can't associate with you. And actually, two other brothers did the same thing. They actually left the family, and they cut off all communications. That's how serious they were about it. And so here's a letter from Dr. Still in 1895. By then, he was, a much older person in his 60s, and he only knew a few of the family members that had actually become Methodist preachers like his father. But of the 13, the other 10, they had no connection. They really severed it. And then just a little talk from the family is, again, as they were reconnected to the other Stills in the 1900s, they talked about Father Abram had started out to doctor, became a Methodist preacher from talking to basically the slaves, and became an outspoken abolitionist. And that's what alienated him from his family. In the end, when the war came in the United States against slavery and other issues, A.T. Still's family, the slave owners probably went into quite a bit of problems and stuff. So that brings us to John Wesley. So A.T. Still's daddy looked to England, to John Wesley, who thought that the church was becoming too powerful. It's all about the churches. It was all about the money. He says there are social needs. There's the poor. There's the kid who's hungry who steals a loaf of bread and then goes to prison for 5 years. And so either he dies in prison or comes out an even worse criminal. And so Wesley said we need to do better taking care of people, and we need to love our people better. We need to get out from the churches and get where the people don't have access, the poorest people. And if we can send our preachers as doctors for the body and preachers for the soul, then we will be doing them more work. And this is where we become the osteopathic idea of body and spirit and soul. And that remains with us too. We throw in the word mind, and the mind actually lets the intangible spirit, which we all have. The spirit, from Dr. Still's perspective, is there's 1 trillion cells, but only one decision maker. And the things that you see the world as, that is your spirit, that is your soul, that's what makes you unique. And so the body actually just is the vehicle that lets the spirit have this experience, this journey of about 100 years. Osteopathy isn't to prevent death, it's to give you the best quality of your body while you're living and gaining these experiences. But you will die and take that information with you. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next program. So, basically we have Abram, who was trained in Cincinnati and, went out on the prairie. And everywhere they would go, as soon as they get into a rural area, it would be going great. But as soon as money started coming in, slaves would start being bought, and that's when things kind of get bad. And so the Stills kept being moved from Virginia to Newmarket, Tennessee, to Missouri. And again, as the slaves came, finally they were placed on an Indian mission so that there would be no more issue with the slaves. Because again, every time the family would be outspoken, their lives would be threatened. So the church got tired of moving them and finally said, we're going to send you to the Shawnee. Trust me, there won't be any slave issues there. And there weren't. However, the Shawnee started getting diseases from the white man, cholera, usually from our unsanitary waste. And so they basically sold out their land and moved down to Oklahoma. And so the mission only lasted for a few years. The good part is all those people that died from cholera, all those Shawnee Indians, A.T. Still now had access to bodies to really start looking and researching how things work together, because it was very difficult to get bodies.